In 480 BC, the same year the Persian Empire reached the height of its power, a punishment was carried out so brutal, so deliberate, that even the chroniclers of the ancient world struggled to describe it without shuddering. It began in a tent beside the Hellespont, where the sea was black with storm clouds, and the wind carried the smell of salt and blood. King Xerxes, son of Darius the Great, stood alone, his eyes fixed on the waves that had dared to defy him. The bridges he had ordered, built across the waters, had been torn apart by the sea. To his generals it was an accident of nature. To Xerxes, it was an act of rebellion. That night he did not curse the engineers who had failed him. He cursed the sea. He ordered it whipped with chains, 300 lashes upon the water, and commanded his soldiers to brand it with hot iron as punishment for disobedience. But the sea was not the only thing that would suffer his wrath. In the darkness beyond his tent, his guards dragged forward the men who had built the bridge. They were tied to stakes, flayed alive, their skin torn away as the waves crashed behind them. The punishment was a warning, but it was also a confession that the king who ruled from India to Egypt had become a prisoner of his own rage. This was the beginning of a spiral that would end years later in the palace of Persepolis, in a chamber filled with gold and terror, where Xerxes would order the most horrifying act ever recorded in Persian history. When Xerxes inherited the throne of Persia, he inherited more than an empire. He inherited an expectation to be greater than his father, to finish what Darius had begun, to conquer the Greek world that had humiliated them. The Persian court had never seen a ruler so consumed by legacy. Every order, every campaign, every monument was an attempt to carve eternity into stone. But when the invasion of Greece collapsed at Salamis, and his vast army was shattered, Xerxes' divine image cracked. The man who had whipped the sea could not command the winds. His soldiers drowned, his fleet burned, his dream of Europe turned to ashes. He returned to Persia in silence, his head bowed, but his heart burning. The journey home was not triumph, but retreat. Those who met him on the road did not see a god returning from conquest, but a man haunted by shame. And shame in the Persian court was a poison. It did not kill quickly, but it destroyed everything it touched. Back in Persepolis, the king withdrew from his generals, his ministers, even his family. He surrounded himself with gold, wine, and dancers, drowning his humiliation in ritual and pleasure. Yet beneath the feasts and ceremonies, paranoia festered. He saw betrayal everywhere, in advisors who hesitated, in brothers who spoke too softly, in servants who averted their eyes. The empire that once bowed to him now whispered behind his back, and then came the betrayal that broke what little reason he had left. It began with his brother Amestris, a man known for loyalty and wisdom. Xerxes had trusted him as few others, but one night during a royal banquet, the king noticed something he could not forget: the beauty of Amestris' wife. Her grace, her poise, her silence. It was said that Xerxes' gaze lingered too long, that his thoughts crossed the line between admiration and desire. In the days that followed, he could not erase her from his mind. But in the Persian court, the wife of a royal brother was untouchable. To covet her was to commit blasphemy against blood itself. So Xerxes did something even more dangerous. He turned his attention to her daughter, a girl named Artainte, young, beautiful, and naive enough to believe that a king's affection was an honor. He seduced her in secret, promising love, promising power, and giving her a gift that would seal her fate: a robe woven by his own queen, Amestris, a garment sacred to royal blood. When Amestris saw her hand-woven robe adorning another woman, she understood immediately. She said nothing. Not that day, not the next. She waited. And when the king's birthday arrived, when all of Persia's nobility gathered to celebrate, she made her move. Custom, on the royal birthday, any request made to the king could not be refused. It was the one day when even Xerxes' word could be bound by oath. In front of the entire court, Amestris stepped forward and made her request. Her voice was calm, her eyes unblinking. She asked not for gold, not for land, not for power, but for the wife of Amestris, her husband's sister-in-law. The court fell silent. Xerxes hesitated, knowing what this meant. But he could not deny her. To break an oath before the eyes of his court would destroy what remained of his divine image. He granted her request. Amestris took the woman away under guard. No one saw what happened next, except the eunuchs and the slaves who were later executed to preserve the secret. What they described was horror beyond measure. The queen ordered the woman's ears, nose, lips and tongue cut off. Her breasts were torn from her chest. Her body was mutilated, her remains displayed as an example to every woman in the royal court. When Amestris heard what had been done to his wife, he fled the palace in rage, gathering men to rebel against the king. But Xerxes, upon hearing of his brother's flight, sent his soldiers after him. Amestris and his sons were captured and executed without trial. The royal bloodline that had once guarded the empire's unity was extinguished in a single night, all because of the desire, pride and shame of a king who could not master himself. The punishment ordered that night would echo across centuries. Herodotus, the historian who chronicled the empires of the ancient world, wrote that even he hesitated before putting ink to parchment, calling it one of the most horrifying acts ever committed within a royal court. For the Persians, it became a whispered memory, proof that the wrath of kings was more feared than the swords of enemies. And yet the story did not end there, because Xerxes himself, the man who once commanded nations, would not die in glory or in war. He would die the way all tyrants do, betrayed by those closest to him, murdered in his bed by his own guards, his blood soaking the same marble he once believed eternal. The morning after the queen's vengeance, the halls of the Persian palace were silent. Servants walked barefoot through corridors where the scent of blood clung to the air, and not even the whisper of silk disturbed the stillness. The mutilated body of Amestris' wife had been carried away before dawn, but the horror lingered, woven into the very stones of Persepolis. Those who had witnessed it spoke no words, for words could not capture what they had seen. The Queen of Persia had taken her revenge, and the King of Kings had allowed it. Xerxes sat alone in his throne room that morning, staring at the empty space where his brother had once stood during council. The golden lions beneath his feet glimmered faintly in the light of torches, their reflections broken by his trembling hands. He was the ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen, from the mountains of Bactria to the plains of Anatolia. Yet in that moment, he looked less like a god and more like a man being eaten alive from within. He had watched his empire rise to power, conquer kingdoms and crush rebellions. He had believed that fear would preserve order, but now he understood that fear had turned inward, poisoning the blood of his own court. He had seen the terror in the faces of his ministers, the hollow stares of his guards, the way even his son spoke to him with rehearsed devotion. He had built an empire of silence, and now he lived in it. The news of Amestris' death spread like smoke through the provinces. In Bactria, soldiers murmured that the gods had turned from their king. In Babylon, priests whispered that Xerxes' victories had been purchased with blasphemy. And in the western provinces, where the wounds of Greece still festered, the people began to look upon the Persian king not as divine, but as cursed. Xerxes' paranoia deepened. He dismissed old advisors and replaced them with flatterers who told him what he wished to hear. He built new palaces, new statues, new tombs, monuments to remind the world of his divinity. But each new stone seemed to carry the weight of his sins. The more he built, the emptier he became. The historians say that after the queen's revenge, Xerxes began to spend his nights wandering the palace alone. He would walk through the halls of Persepolis in silence, past frescoes of his own victories, past the columns carved with soldiers and gods. The torchlight flickered against the golden reliefs, and sometimes when the shadows moved, it seemed as if the figures were watching him, their faces twisted with accusation. He could not sleep. In his dreams he saw the faces of the dead, the bridge builders flayed at the Hellespont, the generals executed for failure, the artisans tortured for imperfection, his brother's wife screaming without a tongue. and behind them all stood the ghost of Darius, his father, the king who had once built the empire with patience and order. Xerxes saw him clearly in his nightmares, not in anger, but in disappointment. Even his queen, Amestris, the woman who had unleashed such cruelty, became a stranger to him. She still sat beside him in the throne room, her face calm and unreadable, but every time he looked at her, he saw the shadow of what she had done. The marriage that had once bound the throne together had become a silent war, fought with glances and unspoken threats. Years passed, but the stain of that night never faded. The empire continued outwardly strong, its armies vast, its wealth unimaginable. But the foundation had cracked. Governors in distant provinces began to act with independence. The loyalty of the satraps grew uncertain. The unity that had once defined the Achaemenid dynasty began to fray, thread by thread. And then came the night when the cycle of blood finally turned against the king himself. It was late summer, the year 465 BC. The air was heavy with the scent of burning oil and crushed pomegranate. Xerxes was older now, his hair streaked with grey, his strength dimmed but his temper unchanged. He had become a man who trusted no one. Not his ministers, not his soldiers, not even his sons. His sleep was guarded by the immortals, the elite corps sworn to die for him. But even they had begun to whisper in secret. Among them were two men, Artabanus, the commander of the royal guard, and Amestris, his confidant. Both had served Xerxes for years. Both had watched him lose himself to paranoia and grief. And both had decided that the time of the King of Kings had come to an end. One night, as the palace slept, they entered the royal bedchamber. The guards at the door bowed as they passed, not realizing what was about to unfold. The torches burned low, the air heavy with the perfume of cedarwood. Xerxes was asleep on his golden bed, his chest rising and falling slowly beneath embroidered linen. The men hesitated only for a moment before striking. When it was over, there was no shouting, no struggle, only silence. The King of Kings was dead, murdered in his sleep by those who had once sworn to protect him. His blood soaked into the silk sheets, dark and gleaming under the moonlight. The empire that had once feared his voice awoke the next morning to find it gone forever. Artabanus would not rule for long. Within days he was executed by Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes I, in a palace purge that mirrored his father's cruelty. The cycle of vengeance continued, passed from father to son, from king to king, until the empire that had ruled half the world began to devour itself from within. When the historians wrote of Xerxes after his death, they wrote of his victories, his monuments, his roads, his bridges, the achievements of a ruler who had once commanded the known world. But between the lines they wrote something else, that greatness without mercy becomes madness, and power without restraint becomes its own destruction. Herodotus, the historian who dared to write what others feared, ended his account of Xerxes not with triumph, but with silence. He did not glorify his wars or his palaces. He wrote of the sea whipped in rage, the bridges broken by pride, and the queen's cruelty that turned a dynasty into a nightmare. For Herodotus understood what Xerxes never did, that no man, no matter how divine he believes himself to be, can rule the world if he cannot first rule his own heart. And so the story of that night became a whisper in the corridors of power,